Have you ever wondered if a single law could just completely redraw a country's financial map? Well, today, we're digging into a bill that does pretty much just that. It's called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA for short.
And believe me, the people who analyzed this bill did not mince words. They called its impact a sudden, dramatic, and lasting change. We're not just talking about shuffling some numbers around on a spreadsheet here. No, this is about fundamentally reshaping how governance and finance work in the U.S. So the big question is, what's actually in this thing? Let's get into it.
All right, so what is the OBBA officially? It's what's known as a reconciliation bill. And, that might sound like some boring political jargon, but it's actually a huge deal. Why? Because using reconciliation meant it could get through the Senate with just a simple majority vote, completely sidestepping the usual filibuster. That's the key that unlocked the door to this massive overhaul of, well, pretty much everything. Taxes, spending, the whole shebang.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll tackle the huge tax overhaul. Then we'll follow the money and look at the new spending priorities. After that, we'll see how the government itself is changing because of this. And finally, we'll get to the bottom line, that massive $3.4 trillion price tag.
All right, let's kick things off with the tax code. And just to be clear, the OBBBA didn't just, nudge a few percentages here and there. It really created a whole new structure. And at the heart of it is a really simple question. Who gets the benefits and how long do they get to keep them?
When you look at the tax changes, you see this really interesting split. It's almost like two different sets of rules. In one corner, you've got permanent tax cuts, things like full expensing for R&D and a big deduction for pass-through businesses. But in the other corner, you have temporary relief, like no taxes on overtime or tips. The key thing to see here is that the tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest folks, those were made permanent, locked in. But the relief for middle-class workers, that stuff has an expiration date.
So let's drill down on those permanent changes for a second. We're talking about 100% expensing, which is a huge deal for companies investing in R&D and new equipment. They can write it all off right away. Then there's the estate tax exemption, which gets jacked up to $15 million per person. That means incredibly wealthy families can pass on a whole lot more money without it being taxed. And by making things like opportunity zones a permanent part of the landscape, these aren't just temporary perks. They're baked into the system now.
But these massive changes to the tax code are really only half the story. You have to look at the other side of the ledger, the spending side, to get the full picture. And what we see there is just as dramatic. The source material even calls it a tale of two budgets.
And you can really see that contrast when you look at the numbers. On one hand, you have a massive cut to Medicaid. We're talking $900 billion over the next decade.
And where does some of that money go? Well, it's contrasted with a $150 billion increase in new spending, all of it for border enforcement and deportations.
You see the same pattern with nutrition funding, a cut of $186 billion, mostly hitting programs like SNAP.
And on the flip side, a $25 billion boost for military quality of life improvements. The priorities here are, well, they're pretty clear.
So where is all that new enforcement money actually going? Well, nearly $30 billion is going to expand ICE operations, and the stated goal is to support 1 million people every single year. Another $46.5 billion is for border infrastructure, like wall systems. Then there's $45 billion to add 100,000 new migrant detention beds. And on top of that, $10 billion for a brand new fund to help states get more involved in federal enforcement. Now, it's not just about the big numbers. It's how these cuts are made that really matters. For SNAP, the food stamp program, the work requirement age was bumped up from 49 all the way to 65. And, really critically, exemptions that used to exist for veterans and homeless individuals were just gone. When it comes to Medicaid, states are now left holding the bag. They're expected to cover about half of that $900 billion shortfall from the federal government. And, of course, this has a domino effect, hitting organizations like Planned Parenthood, where we're told about 1 in 3 of their centers are now at risk of closing down because of the funding loss.
So you've got these huge shifts in taxes and spending. But the story doesn't end there. All of this creates a massive ripple effect that actually changes the way government itself works, shifting who has the power and who has the responsibility.
And how big is this ripple effect? Well, the sources we're looking at use a pretty powerful word. They call it a tsunami of after effects for the states. That paints a picture of just immense, almost overwhelming pressure being put on state and local governments.
So why a tsunami? Think of it as a perfect storm with 4 parts. First, the states are suddenly on the hook for billions in Medicaid funding that's just vanished. Second, when the federal government cuts taxes, it often automatically cuts state tax revenue too, because their tax codes are linked. Third, you've got a classic squeeze. Federal support is drying up, right as the demand for state services is going up. And to top it all off, states are now being asked to take on responsibilities they haven't had to deal with in like 50 to 100 years. It's a massive shift.
And while all this pressure is being pushed down to the states, the bill is also actively weakening key federal agencies. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, its funding cap got chopped by almost half. The EPA, it lost its greenhouse gas reduction fund completely. And the SEC, the watchdog for Wall Street, its reserve fund was just eliminated, ordered to close, with the money sent back to the Treasury.
Now, as you can imagine, this did not go unnoticed. The head of the main union for government employees went on record calling this a big retaliation bill. The fear, according to the source material, is that this is all designed to undermine the whole idea of a professional civil service, making it much easier to get rid of federal workers for purely political reasons. Okay, so we've talked taxes, we've talked spending, and we've talked about the restructuring of government. All of this adds up, so let's get to the bottom line. What's the final price tag?
According to the official scorekeeper, the Congressional Budget Office, this bill is projected to add, get this, $3.4 trillion to the national deficit over the next 10 years.
So what does a number that big actually mean for the country? Well, think of it like a chain reaction. First, the deficit goes up. That means more federal debt. When the debt gets bigger, it can cost more for the government to borrow money. And that pressure cooker of higher borrowing costs often leads to one of two things down the road. Either more spending cuts, also known as austerity, or future tax hikes to try and pay for it all.
And when you put it all together, the tax cuts on one side and the spending cuts on the other, a pretty stark picture starts to form. Analysis that looks at who wins and who loses projects that by 2027, the top 1% will be doing significantly better, with higher after-tax incomes. At the same time, the bottom 80% are projected to have lower after-tax incomes than they would have otherwise, mainly because of those cuts to social programs. What that analysis is essentially describing is a major upward shift of wealth.
So, in the end, what is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act? Is it a bold, necessary restructuring for a new era, or is it a massive, high-stakes fiscal gamble? The one thing we know for sure is that these changes are now the law of the land. But as we've just walked through, its real legacy and the answer to who ultimately benefits and who pays the price, that story is really just beginning to unfold.